Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and this hour we're just going to get into some of the issues in the news. But as a program note, let me just mention that Chantel McHenry will be with us next hour for a little bit of time, and we're going to talk about this podcast that they have created, which is entitled The History and Evolution of the Black Church. You might say, well, wasn't Black History Month last month? Yes, it was, but of course we had some snow, we had some ice, we had a few programs that got postponed, so we are going to talk a little bit about Black history briefly, and then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news because there is so much to cover. This hour, because it is the Texas hour, I thought I would talk a little bit about the mask issue, the mask mandate, and then something which I don't think a lot of people are aware of, the fact that we have a border crisis, which is certainly not being covered very well by the mainstream media in the rest of the country. Not really sure it's being covered very well here in the state of Texas, or for those of you that live in the border states. And I recognize most of our audience this hour are Texans, but not necessarily. So thank you for those of you that tune in through the internet to listen to this hour as well, because we will be covering some of that information. And as you have probably heard people say, this mask mandate, and whether we have a mandate or don't have a mandate, is probably, as I've said before, kind of like a Rorschach test, an ink blot test. People see into it whatever they want to see into it. If indeed they are convinced that masks are the answer to actually controlling the coronavirus, then you've had some very strong statements being made about the fact that this is going to be a death sentence for so many individuals. Drudge has a little piece that came out from one woman who works in ICU, who has said this has been devastating, and she's absolutely fearful of the number of people that may be affected by this mask mandate being removed. And, of course, I can understand her feelings. She has been holding the hands of people that have died in front of her, and so there are all sorts of people that are thinking this is a really bad idea. If you do a survey, I noticed a couple of radio stations last night locally asked, do you think this is a good idea or bad idea? You ready for it to come off? I'm almost 2-1 saying they approved of it. So, again, people see into it what they want. But there has been an unwillingness to at least put this in some kind of context. If you look at this, this comes from the Associated Press, so it must be true. Texas is not the first state, and in fact, this one's actually from the Austin Statesman-American. There is not the only one to end a statewide requirement for people to wear a mask in public. 15 other states either lifted their mask mandate or never adopted one in the first place. What are those states? Alaska, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Iowa, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, South Carolina, and Tennessee, to mention just a few. Add one more, that would be Texas. Now, of course, Texas is the largest, so that's why a lot of people are talking about it. And again, Texas has decided to lift the mask mandate. Governor Greg Abbott announced that yesterday, now making it the largest state to no longer require one of the most effective ways, it says in this article, to slow the spread of the coronavirus. The announcement in Texas, where the virus has killed more than 43,000 people, rattled doctors and big city leaders. And, of course, you can see that the emphasis there is on how masks are saving lives. To put this in perspective a little bit, and you all have your own particular view on this, so I'm not going to try to dissuade you one way or the other. You've got to remember that this time last year, we actually took the time to bring Dr. Jay Richards on the program because we had been told that masks do not help prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Do you remember that? I mean, of course, you have to have a pretty good memory, but Dr. Jay Richards has been one that has over time written about this, and he first of all posted an article that was in the stream and argued that actually masks do provide some benefit. Well, this was coming at a time when Anthony Fauci says, no, masks don't do any good. Jerome Adams, the Surgeon General, says, don't go out and buy masks. And we were saying, wait a minute. We recognize that there are people who are working in the medical facilities right now who are wearing masks. So then, with a straight face to look in front of the camera and say that masks don't help, just strains credulity and certainly does not pass what we oftentimes call the straight face test. And so we actually brought him on the program to talk about the fact that there were studies that were done even before the coronavirus. Many of these were SARS studies, and they had found that it was kind of good, better, and best. You know, some covering would be okay, but not helpful. Something with double layers and a filter would be better. And, of course, the top of the line was, of course, the so-called N95. So we were actually doing programs a year ago saying, you know, masks do help. Now, at the same time, we also pointed out that the studies were actually very clear that you have to use the mask effectively. It reminds me of one of the arguments being used sometimes for why we need to distribute condoms to kids in the public schools and through school-based clinics is because we have proven that nobody gets an STD if they use these kinds of devices. And what I found so interesting is you go back and look at the original research, it says, yes, when they are used consistently and correctly. How many teenagers use these things consistently and correctly? The same thing applies here with the mask. There was a very good study that came out last year in Lancet, which is kind of the premier medical journal of UK, in which it points out that these masks do prevent the spread of coronavirus. But if you read the fine print, they have to be used consistently and correctly. There are a lot of people I see walking around with a mask half on or one that is just a piece of cloth that obviously doesn't do any good, and it kind of illustrates the point. Anyway, to maybe cause you to read a little bit more about that, I still think one of the best books written about the coronavirus and really the dangers of the lockdown and what we know or don't know about mask and transmission is in the book The Price of Panic. And I mentioned Dr. Jay Richards. He was one of the three authors of that. We did that interview a number of months ago. So again, I think the fair assessment is that masks make a difference. Are they perfect? No, they're not. As a matter of fact, if you don't use them consistently and correctly, they actually give you a feeling of safety when you do not have it. But again, a lot of that gets back to the harsh reality is some people are going to take appropriate precautions, and some people are going to act like less credible individuals. And you have seen that out on the freeway. Driving here today, I saw a lot of people driving very safely, and I saw two individuals who seemed like they wanted to put their car in the right corner of my front bumper because they were driving like, can I use the word, idiots. The same people that drive cars like that sometimes don't use masks, sometimes go to places where there is very obvious spreading that can take place. And so you can't control stupid behavior. You can try, but I don't think it's going to work. Anyway, the mask mandate is off. 15 other states have already done it, and Texas has joined it. We're going to get into some other more important issues right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Khaldun Swice admits that reaching your secular friends with the gospel is difficult, but there are things we can do to be more effective. He and I have worked together at the International Society of Christian Apologetics, so I was excited to see many commentators like Ed Stetzer and Eric Metaxas quoting him. Khaldun says we make a mistake when we ignore the trends and zeitgeist of the times, and we make grave mistakes when we try to stereotype people into this or that category. Sometimes the best starting point is to ask a question. When someone tells him that they don't believe in God, he asks, "What God do you not believe in?" He says that 9 times out of 10, it is usually a God that we Christians don't believe in. He has 3 principles we should adopt so that we can be more effective in reaching our secular friends. First, we must engage. He says we should sit at the table where we have the attention of your secular friends. Connect with them by getting involved with Apple computers, with Congress, or with sports. We'll be more effective if we sit at the table where most decisions are made by government, culture, media, and education. Second, we must inquire. That means we need to turn the table to listening and asking good questions. The Bible admonishes us to let your speech always be gracious and seasoned with salt. He tells of a student who told him that he did not believe in anything that is not physical. Khaldun asked him if his idea was physical. After all, not believing in anything that is non-physical is a non-physical idea. Third, we should edify. That means we should reach across the table and learn to love people redemptively. The gospel is ultimately about relationships, and we can demonstrate the truth of the gospel through love. These principles will help you be more effective in reaching your secular friends. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can move on to a topic that is not being covered very well by the mainstream press. And we aren't going to cover a lot of it today, but we will probably get back to it in the future. And it's the issue of immigration. Those of you watching online, you can see I'm holding up our booklet on a biblical view on immigration, because this is one of the more convoluted issues. Because on the one hand, we certainly, as I talk about in this booklet, as individuals who believe in the rule of law, recognize that Romans 13, 1-7 talks about government and the fact that we should be in subjection to government authorities. So on the one hand, we certainly recognize, as from a Christian point of view, that we need to maintain borders. We need to have a rule of law. And when people have come into this country illegally, just as if they came into your house illegally, you have to address the issue. And so you have to obviously talk about the importance of the rule of law. But by the 5th page in here, I also talk about the fact that the Old Testament, and I think just common sense, requires that we would have compassion towards aliens and immigrants. And there is an interesting debate taking place right now about how do we address this issue of what is becoming a flood of immigrants on our border. Are you hearing about this for the first time? That tells you a lot about how the press covers things very differently, how they've actually had to begin to house some of these children that are unaccompanied minors in various facilities. Oh, that was something that was being very strongly criticized by the Trump administration. And even a Democratic member of Congress from Texas saying, when we talk about this issue of amnesty, we really should ask that these individuals go to perhaps the embassy in their country or their next country to apply for amnesty, because then we can actually investigate whether or not they do need asylum and amnesty and those kinds of things. And so these desires for asylum and eventually getting amnesty so they won't be prosecuted need to take place in the other countries. Oh, you mean kind of like what the Trump administration was proposing and was doing for some time. You again are not having hardly anybody in the press criticizing much of what's being done now under the Biden administration that was done under the Trump administration. So it is, I think, important to recognize that if we want to provide a way to treat people with some kind of respect, because they have come here because they are maybe fleeing from persecution and they do need asylum and they do want to work here, and we need to give them some kind of amnesty or maybe even a path to citizenship or a worker visa or something. We need to address those issues. And so this booklet's attempt to really recognize that you really have both the issue of the rule of law and certainly want to treat individuals with compassion. But when you start sending the signal that we're going to tear down the wall between Mexico and the United States, when you send the signal that we're going to provide a path to citizenship to, and they always say the 11 million, the best estimates are probably 30 million people that are here illegally, it encourages more people to come. So that brings me to my second article, and this is written by Byron York. Byron York was very clear in saying that he says, this is his subtitle, "The Biden team is in full denial mode about the border crisis." He says, during the campaign, candidate Joe Biden promised to undo President Trump's border security policies. He pledged to halt all deportations for 100 days and allow asylum seekers who enter the United States illegally to stay in this country while their cases are being considered, rather than wait in Mexico as Trump required. Can I add a few facts that never show up in any kind of media recording or posting? And first of all, this is the issue of asylum. How many individuals who actually file for asylum are then in this country granted asylum? You know what that number is? It's 20%. In other words, 8 out of 10 that ask for asylum do not provide enough evidence that they should actually receive asylum. So you recognize that many of those people that use asylum use it as an excuse because they want to come to this country because they want a job or they want to put their family on welfare, whatever it is. There are all sorts of reasons. Some come here because they want to just achieve the American dream. Some here come because they see it's an easy life. Some, frankly, come here because they are involved in a terrorist network. The percentages are ones that we can debate all day, but there are a variety of reasons why people come across this border. So anyway, Byron York goes on to say it was obvious that the Biden's changes would attract a flood of new illegal immigrants. No surprise there. So during the transition, the president-elect sounded a note of caution. In late December, Joe Biden told reporters that he would not throw out the Trump program immediately, lest the United States end up with 2 million people on the border. That's a direct quote from Joe Biden, candidate still, President-elect Joe Biden, however you want to say it. Instead, Biden said he would take some time to set up guardrails to make sure that his new system would work smoothly. But, as Byron York points out, prospective illegal border crossers got the message. Come to the United States and you can stay. And now under President Biden, they are not waiting for the new administration to set up the guardrails to handle them. They're coming here right now. About 78,000 people tried to illegally illegally into the United States in January. That's more than double the number of January 2020. And that's a good comparison because, once the coronavirus and the pandemic hit, of course, we saw a decrease in the number of people trying to come into into this country. But a January to January comparison, I think, is a fair apples to apples comparison. And we had twice as many people coming to the border, and I don't see that number diminishing anytime soon. So then Byron York says that the White House spokeswoman, Jen Psaki, practically begged would-be illegal crossers not to stay away, but to wait a few weeks or months before illegal crossing. Now is not the time to come, and the vast majority will be turned away. She then also said that asylum processes at the border will not occur immediately. It will take time to implement, which is why you have a very significant division right now between the, if you will, Biden administration and some members of Congress, certainly Republicans, but even some members of the Democratic side in Congress that are saying we need to do asylum the way it was supposed to be done under the Trump administration, because 8 out of 10, 80%, are not qualifying as asylum seekers. Anyway, Byron York goes on to say, but the rush continues with as many, are you ready for this number? 4,000 people every day trying to cross the border illegally. If Trump were still in power, this would be a big story, don't you think? It took me a little bit of work to find this story, but there, again, credit goes to Byron York and the Washington Examiner. And now the administration has moved into full denial mode. This Monday, you have the Homeland Security Secretary, that would be Alejandro Mayorkas, who insisted that there was no crisis at the border. She said, the answer is no. I think there is a challenge at the border that we are managing, and we have the resources dedicated to managing it. Then when a reporter challenged her, respectfully, sir, though one of your predecessors, Jay Johnson, that would be President Obama's Homeland Security Secretary, said that 1,000 illegal border crossings a day constitutes a crisis, that it overwhelms the system. We're now between 3,000 and 4,000 now, according to your officials. So how is this not a crisis? But of course, she said this is no crisis. She simply said it's a challenge. Yes, it is. It's 4 times what it was under the Obama administration when it was called a crisis, and much larger than the crisis that even faced the Trump administration. And so she said, we're challenged at the border. The men and women of the Department of Homeland Security are meeting the challenge, and the Biden administration is building the challenge to meet our humanitarian aspirations and execution of the president's vision. Well, you're only going to get away with that for maybe a few more days, but at least a compliant press right now has not even talked about the fact that I think any reasonable individual would say there is a crisis at the border, and there are some very significant steps that would have to be taken if you understood that it was a crisis. And as some members of Congress have pointed out, this is a crisis that is exacerbated by the fact that many of the people that they do catch, they can't house, so they release into the general population, and a very significant number of them have the coronavirus infection, and so it spreads it into the society as well. These are issues that deserve some attention. That's why we're talking about it today here on Point of View. I'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Some of our other articles that we've posted here I may not get to this hour, but we might cover next hour. The attempt to cancel Dr. Seuss. I just figured that because we've been talking about the cancel culture is a good illustration of that. I probably will this hour at least get to the one by Pat Buchanan, is Biden re-enlisting in the forever wars. There have been a lot of people that have been saying that there has been a real frustration on the part of what you might even call the military-industrial complex that the previous president, that would be Donald Trump, did not want to get involved in forever wars and did his best to try to not create one and to actually draw down troops. Of course, what has been happening more recently is Joe Biden has felt that there was a need to bring an attack in Syria, and also maybe to even step up activity there as well. So that's another issue we may get to later, but let me, if I can, finish this off. I've been talking about the Homeland Security Secretary, that's Alejandro Mayorkas, and it is basically one of the statements that you're getting right now from Mayorkas saying, what we are saying to those of you coming is don't come. We're not saying don't come. We're saying don't come now, because we will be able to deliver a safe and orderly process to you as quickly as possible. Now, that's like saying to kids, eventually you're going to get dessert, but you got to do all of this before you get your dessert. Well, they're going to want to eat the dessert as quickly as they can. And the bottom line is, as Byron York points out, they're not waiting. And why should they? Many are being allowed to stay right now. And one of the interesting reports that comes from the Border Patrol is that they released 350 migrants into the streets of Yuma, Arizona. And the Yuma mayor, Douglas Nichols, told them that the city lacks the resources, the manpower, and the money to help hundreds of people who, because Border Patrol lacks space and transportation, cannot be held or taken into Phoenix, where the Immigration and Customs Enforcement would normally detain families. And so you've got this incredible crisis that is unfolded. Now, before I move on to another topic, let me try to tie the first two together. You might say, how does that come together? You were just talking earlier about masks and the coronavirus, and now you're talking about immigration. Here's the connection. Border crossers that have been released into the interior of the United States, I'm reading from one of these articles, by the Department of Homeland Security, have tested positive for the coronavirus. And so as a result, this has become what some people have referred to as a super spreader event. Let me just jump to one individual that has said that. That would be Senator Tom Cotton, a senator from Arkansas, along with a number of other Senate Republicans, have been demanding answers from the Biden administration on their release of border crossers without coronavirus testing. Those that have been actually tested, there were, in one case, the best estimate from Brownsville, Texas. Okay, so Brownsville, Texas is one place where there was enough testing to say that they have a positivity rate of more than 6%. Well, that's pretty high if you think about that. So you have people coming into this country that are actually testing positive for the coronavirus, but they're not quarantined. They're not put in a separate facility because we don't have the facilities available to them. We are just letting them into the country. And let's, again, bring it back to Texas, since that particular test was over 6%. You're letting them into Texas. So the argument being used right now by Senator Tom Cotton is that President Biden's border crisis is a super spreader event. Now, I'm going to make a prediction. I could be wrong, but I'm going to predict that it is quite likely that the number of coronavirus cases will increase in Texas. And I will predict that the mainstream press, and maybe even all the local press, will be saying that that's because we removed the mask mandate. And I'm not denying that some of that might be the case, but I also think that there is a very good likely possibility, is probably a better way to say it, that some of that will simply be due to the fact that we are bringing people in who are, when they're tested, are testing at a high enough rate to understand that they could create a super spreader event, and that those individuals being allowed into the general population, who probably are the least likely to wear masks, least likely to use some of the kinds of public health guarantees that we as Americans have been actually had drummed into our heads over the last 9 months, are going to probably spread those very significantly. So you would think that the reaction to that would be, well, let's at least test them at the border. Let's see if we can quarantine them. At least let's educate them to not go into the general population. And you would be wrong. Turns out that there is a letter that was sent to Alexander Mayorkas by 61 Democrats in the House of Representatives requesting that the Department of Health and Human Services and the Center for Disease Control Title 42. And you go, well, what in the world is that? That is something that actually requires that we do test individuals and quarantine anybody coming into this country who actually tests positive. But instead, they wrote that the Biden administration ought to be releasing all foreign nationals arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border into the U.S. interior without testing requirements so as not to spread the coronavirus in foreign countries. I'm not making this up. That's what they said in the letter. And again, you can read the letter itself. So we are going to be, in some respects, seeing a connection between the issue of the coronavirus and the issue of immigration. And, of course, all of that coming from an administration which right now is denying that there is any crisis at all. New York ends his piece, by the way, by saying whether the Biden administration will admit it or not, and with Mayorkas' message to potential illegal crossers, please come, just give us a little while to prepare, the flow is sure to increase. And I think you can say that without any hesitation, and it's an illustration of what's going to happen in the future. Let me, just before I take a break, mention one other issue. Pat Buchanan has been on the program with us many times before. He's still writing a column. As a matter of fact, the other day when I mentioned Pat Buchanan, somebody said, is he still alive? Yeah, he's still alive, and he's still writing columns. And I think it's the fourth column on our list, because he's pointing out that just now we are starting to see that the Biden Pentagon is gearing up for a military engagement. Now, of course, last Thursday was when you had the first action. The Pentagon sent 2 F-15Es to strike targets in the Iranian-backed Iraqi militia just outside of the eastern border of Syria. Now, the strikes supposedly were in retaliation for a missile attack on a U.S. base in Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, which killed a contractor and wounded a U.S. soldier. And so now you have the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, saying we're confident that the target was being used by the same Shia militia that conducted the strikes. But now you're starting to have even fellow Democrats saying, wait a minute. First of all, it was interesting to see the Twitter response last week. Of course, I was up in Alaska at the time, so I didn't have a chance to talk about that. But there were individuals saying, wait a minute, we elected Biden to get a $15 an hour pay increase, and we to deal with the immigration and to deal with the coronavirus. And instead, what does he do? He fires targets and missiles into Syria, and we're about ready to get involved in another war, they feared. So if nothing else, you have a number of senators, that would be Tim Kaine, who's a Democrat, Chris Murphy, also a Democrat, who want to know where President Joe Biden got his authority to launch attacks in Syria when there was no clear or present danger to any U.S. troops. And so there is a growing dissatisfaction among the Democrats about what is taking place. To be fair, you don't see me too often talking about at least Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being consistent, but she has been very consistently criticizing the Trump immigration policy, and now she's criticizing the Biden immigration policy. And again, you certainly had people like Tim Kaine and Chris Murphy, both senators, one from Virginia, one from Connecticut, criticizing the Trump administration, and now they're criticizing the Biden administration. But I think it just illustrates again that things are going to be pretty rough pretty quick for the Biden administration, as illustrated by something I'll talk about after the break. It's been a bad couple of days and weeks for Democratic leaders, both governors and the president. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that in the next hour, we're going to have Chantel McHenry with us, talking about the history and evolution of the Black church. It's a podcast, so you can do a lot of research in that regard. I think you'll really appreciate that. And just as a program note, in 2 hours, or another hour, I guess I should say, from the 2 to 3 o'clock hour, Michael Sherrard will be with us. We'll talk about why you matter, how your guest quest for meaning is meaningless without God, and it's been a great kind of outreach to the younger generation, so I think you'll appreciate that as well. But I did mention just a minute ago that this has not been a good couple of weeks certainly a couple of days, but even weeks now for the Biden administration or for other Democrats that are governors. Let's kind of go through the list fairly quickly. I talked about immigration, and you might have remembered that we've talked on more than one occasion about a federal judge that has blocked the ban that President Biden wanted to put on deportations. This was a judge, by the way, that was put in position by the previous president, that's Donald Trump, and an individual that was actually recommended by Kelly Shackelford. You also, of course, have had the first nominee to withdraw, and that would be Neera Tanden, who had to withdraw her nomination to lead the Office of Management and Budget because she was too extreme even for some of the Democrats and certainly for the Republicans. And the latest poll that's come out has said that 67% of Americans, in other words, 2/3 of Americans, reject the open borders catch and release policy. Wait till they find out that the people we're releasing are testing positive for the coronavirus, and they are being released sometimes into some states like California, which still have a lockdown because they're trying to control the coronavirus. That percentage is going to go up pretty quickly, I would suspect. While I'm talking about California, it's not been a good time for governors in places like California and New York, both Democratic governors, because these are governors which, of course, have been, if nothing else, really engaged in lockdowns. But in the case of California, you have all sorts of recall efforts that look like they're going forward against Gavin Newsom. And in New York, you have a very significant and growing scandal that affects the governor there, Andrew Cuomo. So that is the case. And if you look at this, Gary Bauer points out that you also have 3 more liberal lockdown governors have their own potential nursing home scandals. I won't go into the details because it's not that important at the moment, but it just illustrates again that at a time when the arguments always have been that those who kept it open, like South Dakota, or open prematurely, like they say of the governor of Florida, or now they're saying of Texas, the real problems sometimes are happening in the particular parts of the country in states which had the extreme lockdown. So lots of things to talk about in that regard. One more that Gary Bauer posted, which I thought was really interesting. 64%, almost 2/3 of Americans believe the cancel culture is a threat to freedom and liberty. And I will next hour spend a little bit of time talking about that as it relates to Dr. Seuss. You know, yesterday was what was called Read Across America Day. This has been something that was launched back in the 1990s to encourage children to read. And it, interestingly enough, coincides with the birthday of the author who, of course, his last name is Giselle, but he goes by the pen name Dr. Seuss. And, of course, back in the less woke days, people like President George W. Bush, President Barack Obama, President Donald Trump regularly issued proclamations celebrating Read Across America Day and oftentimes applauded Dr. Seuss for the joy his books brought to children. But you have probably, if you've been in the news at all, heard the fact that we no longer live in those times, and the Biden White House decided to drop Dr. Seuss from its statement. And, of course, the reason is pretty understandable. The social justice warriors, or the woke mob, whatever you want to call them, that have been trying to erase, Christopher Columbus, George Washington, Robert E. Lee, and others, decided it was time for Dr. Seuss to go. Now, what is his offense? Well, it's twofold. First of all, he published some cartoons 80 years ago that might be somewhat offensive by today's standards, but they were using kind of the common, if you will, vernacular of that day. And then number two, some of those ended up in the books that kids are still reading. And of course, you can recognize that if you were going to be really careful, you might want to use a scalpel rather than a meat cleaver. You might say, okay, maybe that book, it's time to set that aside or put it in restricted reading because of all the rest. But I love what Gary Bauer says. He said, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. This shows the obsessive desire to regulate everything you do, say, think, and even what you read to your children. At a time when children have lost an entire year of in-school instruction, and I'm going to produce very quickly, hopefully, a booklet on just the crisis in education. We had a crisis of education before we locked down the schools. I mean, it is very obvious that young people that were graduating from high school or even graduating from college did not have some of the basic skills necessary to be functioning citizens in America, which is a sad commentary indeed. But nevertheless, the argument that is being made right now is we need to go after Dr. Seuss. So next hour, I will get into that in a little more detail because there was a very good piece. It's one of the articles we've posted that talks about some of the great lessons kids could learn by reading some of the Dr. Seuss books. And some of them are just kind of delightful and full of wordplay, and some of them teach some moral lessons. But you know what? Dr. Seuss is out like just about everything else, and that's part of the cancel culture. But just before we take a break, let me mention again, as I did yesterday, that there's an opportunity for you to express your opinion to your 2 United States senators about the Equality Act. You can go right now to the website, which is pointofview.net. In the middle there, you'll see a section that says Take Action. Contact your senators about the Equality Act. You click on the button that says Take Action. We give you all sorts of facts and information about the attempt to completely rewrite the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and to add all sorts of things like sexual orientation and especially what we talked about yesterday, gender identity. This is something that is not only concerning people that have biblical concerns about this, but even I am finding a good number of people that would call themselves liberal progressives are concerned about this as well. So you click through, and we give you a suggested letter that you can send out to your 2 United States senators. I would hope you know who they are, but even if you don't, as long as you know what your zip code is, we put that in, and that gives you an opportunity then to find out who your 2 senators are. We give you a chance to also put your name and address there and email so that they can respond back to you. And so that is what we have made available to you. And we have been encouraged to see hundreds and hundreds of you yesterday taking advantage of this, but you might be one of those that hadn't gotten around to contacting your 2 senators. So take the time to do so. Whether you think that they are going to support the Equality Act or vote against it, they need to hear from you, and it's your citizenship duty, and we've made it about as easy as possible for you to contact those individuals. So simply go to the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you're going to find all sorts of articles on the mask, on the border. A little bit later, we'll talk about Dr. Seuss, about free speech, and, of course, even the idea of the Biden administration and forever wars. So all of those articles are available on the website. And let's take a break. We'll come back and hopefully learn a little bit about the history and evolution of the Black church right after these important messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about a podcast that actually will be one that I think you'd like to know more about, the history and evolution of the Black Church. It is something we would normally have talked about in February, got postponed till today, so we'll talk about that. I'd certainly like to cover these kinds of issues during Black History Month, and even though it's March, we want to cover that. But let me just, as a program note, mention that after we finish the conversation with her, Chantel, we're going to spend some time getting into a couple of issues. You will notice that I've posted some articles about the fact that we have a border crisis that is really beginning to develop. Do want to get into the whole concern about free speech. Jonathan Turley, who is a professor at George Washington University, and we've quoted before, has a very good piece that we'll talk about. Yesterday, we talked about the cancel culture. Today, I think it's about time to talk about Dr. Seuss, because if nothing else, yesterday was Read Across America. It is something that was launched back in the 1990s to encourage children to read, and the day coincides with the birthday of a man who is known as Dr. Seuss, but now he's being canceled, so we'll talk about that. We have some other material about whether or not we're getting engaged in foreign wars. This is a piece by Pat Buchanan, so there's a lot of material that we will cover later, but I thought it would be helpful for you, if nothing else, to hear a little bit about this podcast that is available called The History and Evolution of the Black Church. And in order to help us understand that, we're going to spend some time talking with Chantel McHenry, who is the Director of Special Initiatives and Operations for an organization called Vanderbloemen, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute. Before that, she has worked at, for example, Lakewood Church and served on the staff there on the ministry team, has also been involved in various local nonprofit organizations. But Chantel, I appreciate you coming on the program today and educating us a little bit about this podcast. But before we do so, first of all, welcome to Point of View.
Kerby, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Let's talk about the organization you're with for just a minute. My producer was very familiar with you because I guess his church has been using your organization to find the next pastor for their church. And I would think that there would be a number of people that would benefit by knowing a little bit more about the executive search firm that you are part of.
Yeah, thank you. So Vanderbloemen, let's see, it was started about 11 years ago by William Vanderbloemen, our CEO and founder. He is a former senior pastor in the Houston area. He used to pastor First Presbyterian Church, and the Lord laid it on his heart to start an executive search firm that would help to serve churches when they're looking for that sort of top tier of the org chart positions, your senior pastors and executive pastors, worship pastors, etc. And then as God began to expand the business, we reached out into nonprofit spaces, Christian schools, family offices, value-based businesses. So we really serve a wide variety of faith-based organizations.
I might just mention that we do have a link to your website. I've had a chance to watch you a little bit on video, and sometimes you're talking about what is happening in your organization, but I've also heard that you have put together something that I wanted our listeners to know more about, and that is called The History and Evolution of the Black Church. And it's a pretty comprehensive history, but tell us a little bit about how that came to be, because some people might wonder how that fits together with the mission statement of your organization.
Yeah. So in addition to executive search, we also are thought leaders in many areas when it comes to church business and faith-based organizations. And one of the things that we're always wanting to do is to put out material that would help bring greater understanding to our listening audience when it comes to church business. And of course, I would say maybe around the end of 2019, the leadership team started having a conversation about how could we serve the Black church better. And that conversation began to evolve as we entered into 2020, which then led us to launching a diversity practice. So we do consulting at Vanderbloemen. We consult for succession planning. We consult with churches and nonprofits for culture, how to build a great culture for your staff and team. And now we're doing consulting for diversity, helping churches to diversify their teams. And as we looked at Black History Month, we thought it was a great opportunity for us to put out some content that would just really give a broad overview of how the Black church came about, and even some of the purposes and visions of the Black church, as well as some of the challenges that the church faces today.
You know, I might just say that for some of our African-American listeners, they would certainly benefit from this podcast. But even if you aren't, one of the things I've seen you say is that when we highlight one part of the church, it sheds more light on the whole church. And if nothing else, we oftentimes tell American history. And candidly, right now, the way American history is even taught in the public schools and in the universities, it even ignores the white church. It even ignores churches and Christians overall. And it even gives even more short shrift to the African American church. So in some respects, you're providing a need for all of us as Christians, but also even for the lack of any kind of conversation about the influence that the church has had in American history.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And yeah, the information, the content is for all colors and backgrounds. It really helps, hopefully, one of our goals is to help bring about unity. So when you think about the body of Christ, we have these pockets, of course, because denominations continue to sort of split and break off and create other denominations based on theology. But we have a commonality in all denominations. That is the redemptive work that Christ did on the cross. And so in that commonality, we want to bring about some understanding so everyone within the church community can grow and begin to unify under that one redemptive quality that we all have.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to do two things before we let you go, and one is to talk about the various time periods so that people have a little bit of an idea of what is in this very extensive podcast on the history and evolution of the Black church, and then also talk about some of the presenters and the expertise and background that they have there as well. And if you find yourself saying, I would like to know a little bit more about this, we, of course, have a link to what Chantel does at Vanderbloemen, and you can find it there. So we're going to take a break. And whether you want to consult them for executive search or learn a little bit more about the history of the Black church, we have that link on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Caldun Swice admits that reaching your secular friends with the gospel is difficult, but there are things we can do to be more effective. He and I have worked together at the International Society of Christian Apologetics, so I was excited to see many commentators like Ed Stetzer and Eric Metaxas quoting him. Caldun says we make a mistake when we ignore the trends and zeitgeist of the times, and we make grave mistakes when we try to stereotype people into this or that category. Sometimes the best starting point is to ask a question. When someone tells him that they don't believe in God, he asks, "What God do you not believe in?" He says that 9 times out of 10, it is usually a God that we Christians don't believe in. He has 3 principles we should adopt so that we can be more effective in reaching our secular friends. First, we must engage. He says we should sit at the table where we have the attention of your secular friends. Connect with them by getting involved with Apple computers, with Congress, or with sports. We'll be more effective if we sit at the table where most decisions are made by government, culture, media, and education. Second, we must inquire. That means we need to turn the table to listening and asking good questions. The Bible admonishes us to let your speech always be gracious and seasoned with salt. He tells of a student who told him that he did not believe in anything that is not physical. Caldun asked him if his idea was physical. After all, not believing in anything that is non-physical is a non-physical idea. Third, we should edify. That means we should reach across the table and learn to love people redemptively. The gospel is ultimately about relationships, and we can demonstrate the truth of the gospel through love. These principles will help you be more effective in reaching your secular friends. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with Chantel McHenry as we talk a little bit about the history and evolution of the Black Church. And this is a podcast which is available. And Chantel, if you can, give us a little bit of an understanding of this, because you really break it into a number of time periods, pre-slavery, of course, slavery, the issue of emancipation, civil rights, death of Martin Luther King Jr., all the way to what is there today. So give us an overview of the number of podcasts, some of the things that are covered, and then I'd love to talk about some of the experts that you've called upon.
Yeah, so we did 5 recordings, 5 podcasts with 5 different sort of educators, theologians that were proficient in the space that we were talking about. And it really covers, right, from the beginning of what was the religion in Africa, how was Christianity brought to the Africans, how was it sort of adopted as Africans were enslaved in the Americas, how was the religion adopted? And then how did it transform to what we see today as the Black Church? The Black Church has been so instrumental in bringing about a place where Blacks could join together when they had no other place to go, where they were actually welcomed. And so this Black people and community, and then in the gospel kind of spread, and people were thinking about, the Christianity that had been adopted by the Africans.
What about some of the kind of more modern examples of this? Because you talk about missionary work conducted in Africa. And then, of course, you have so many brought here on slave ships. But then you take it into emancipation and even the civil rights era. So in some respects, you're covering a lot of ground, but at the same time, you're bringing some facts and figures to the discussion, which oftentimes get ignored, even when we talk about things like slavery, the civil rights movement, or even the Civil War, because you're looking at it from the perspective of the Black church, aren't you?
Absolutely. And so when you look at the series, the first 3 podcasts really are very historical. And then those last 2 probably bring in a lot more meat as it relates to current events and things that have happened over the last 50 to 60 years. Specifically, I'll mention one of the podcasts that will talk about gentrification. So that's a term that we hear a lot about in the news. We hear about communities that are being revitalized. Mostly they're usually downtown or sort of your spine of the city, maybe your midtown of your cities, major cities that are being revitalized. Well, churches, most Black churches were in inner city or inner city areas where now gentrification is somewhat affecting their membership, right? Because you do have the revitalization of communities. So it's an interesting podcast with Pastor John Faison from Watson Grove Missionary Baptist Church. He's in Nashville, Tennessee, and his church is literally going through that particular topic right now. So it's real time. It's telling you how he's handling it and how it affects the Black church, which I think is great for not only other African-American churches to know, but also our white churches to know.
And again, I might just mention, I've got that on my screen right now, the impacts of gentrification on the Black church with Pastor John Faison. Of course, he's senior pastor there in Nashville, Tennessee. And so that is just one of the many podcasts that are part of that series. So some of those get into the history in terms of the Black church, some in terms of what happened during the Reconstruction, Emancipation Reconstruction, some during the Civil Rights Movement, including the whole issue of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and then also a whole section on the place of the Black church in today's racially charged atmosphere. You mentioned Pastor John Faison. Tell us about some of the other experts that you brought in, because some of them are pastors, some of them are history professors, and in some respects they bring quite a bit to the table, which again aren't really being discussed at all in most of the university classrooms today.
Yeah, so we launched the series with Dr. Eric Washington. He's an associate professor and director of African studies at Calvin University. He was really able to bring great perspective to the missionary work that was done in Africa. He's also writing a book that will talk about the missionary work. So it was great to have him on that has such a historical knowledge of that particular topic. And then we had Dr. Butler. Dr. Butler is a professor of religion and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She sort of walks us through that slavery through emancipation time period. And she is well known and has lots of books out when it comes to the religious space. She studied church. She studied Black church, and so she was a great addition to our podcast series. Then Dr. Cheryl Kirk-Dugan. So she is a professor of religion at Shaw University. So Shaw University is the oldest Black university around. And so she works there, has been there for quite a while. She's also an ordained elder in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. So she brings that information, right? The point of view from the CME, which was one of the first churches. It was the first African churches that was actually developed. she talks about Reconstruction and just our newfound freedom here in America. And then, as I mentioned, Dr. Faison was our fourth speaker. And then our last was Pastor Kermit Moss. So Pastor Kermit Moss is an interim director. He's at the Center for Black Church Studies at Princeton University. And he talks about sort of that time period from the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. To current times. He really leans into some of the current events that we saw happening in 2020, right, with the killing of George Floyd to the protests. How does that all tie into even things that we saw, the riots that sort of came about as the result of Dr. King being killed? So he really sort of ties a bow on that, if you will, that kind of ties in both of those time periods together.
Again, I know he's a PhD candidate at Princeton, so we look forward to hearing more from him as well. Well, Chantel, I want to say thank you for putting this together, and for anybody that would like to find those, we have a link. Of course, they can go to Vanderbloemen, but if they don't know how to spell it, the good news is it's on our website, pointofview.net. And thank you for putting together that podcast series, and thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me, Kerby. It's been great.
We want to encourage you to find some of those resources. That has been a story that is not well told. Frankly, if you go to any university today, just about, unless it's a Christian university, they don't tell much of the story about the influence of Christians or the church, other than maybe to talk about the Crusades or a Salem witch trial or something like that. Christianity almost never is presented in a positive way. So first of all, they hardly ever talk about even the white church. They talk even less about the black church. And so I thought this was a very helpful set of resources, and the podcasts are there. And for those of you that maybe are looking for executive search, thought I'd also mention that in passing as well, because your church, your Christian organization might be looking for an individual, and that's something they work on as well. Just before we take a break, we're going to get back into some of the issues in the news. I did want you to find on our website, pointofview.net, the take action item. Yesterday I mentioned the need for you to take the time to contact your 2 United States senators. And yesterday, hundreds of you did that, but I recognize some of you maybe not have heard the program or you didn't get around to it. And so, again, we encourage you to click on that button that says Take Action. We give you some information about the Equality Act. You click through that, put your zip code in, and then you, if you've already done this before, already have your address there. If not, you can add that. We give you a suggested note that you can send to your 2 United States senators, and you can edit it as you wish, and then send it off. And I would encourage you, whether you know your senators are going to vote for the Equality Act or vote against it, they need to hear from you. And so we've made it very easy for you to do so, and it is on the website, pointofview.net. Yesterday I sent an email to those of you receiving emails from us that you can click on. Either way is a great way to contact your senators. We have a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's spend some time looking at some of the issues in the news. As I've told some of you before, we actually do an hour that is heard more locally before we do these 2 hours with you. And in the last hour, I did spend some time talking about the crisis at our border. And if you want to read more about that, we have posted a very good article by Byron York. And I won't spend much time on that, but you could go back and listen to all the information. But I think the best way to summarize it is that there was a very interesting interplay just the last few days in terms of the press and the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Now, she has argued that there is no crisis at the border. It's a challenge, but it's no crisis. And to his credit, one of the reporters said, now, wait a minute. One of your predecessors, that would be Joe Johnson, who was the Homeland Security Secretary under Barack Obama, said that when there were 1,000 illegal border crossings a day, that constituted a crisis. Then he points out, as if you have not been paying attention, there are anywhere from 3,000, most days about 4,000 people every single day trying to cross the border illegally. So how can you, with a straight face, but they do with a straight face, say this is not a crisis, when back in the Obama administration, if you had 1,000 people a day crossing the border, and now you have 4,000 people crossing a border every day, that's not a crisis. Especially when we also have been told that, you know, there are a number of states, now I think it's 15 states, that have dropped their mask mandates, and we think things are doing better, but still people are worried about super spreaders. What about the fact that when we've done any kind of testing of those individuals that show up the border that are released into the general population, I have one test here where it was at least 6% of them tested positive for the coronavirus, and the percentages could even be higher. In some respects, this crisis is not only a crisis of people and humanity and resources and everything else, it's a crisis that could create another super spreader event. And so those are issues that we will be watching this week. And I just wanted to mention that even though this hour I'm not going to get into it, it is one of the articles we posted. And if you're hearing me say that there's a crisis at the border and you're saying, I've seen nothing about this in the media, well, maybe that's why you need to listen to Point of View. I mean, it has been amazing to me how even now the press is starting to say, wait a minute, this is a crisis and we should be covering it, but most of them are not covering it. And you have the administration assuring us there's nothing there to be concerned about. But one of the other articles I wanted to post and did post for you is from Jonathan Turley. And he is, as we've mentioned before, a professor of law at George Washington Universities. He is an individual that would identify himself as a liberal. He's an individual that I'm sure voted for Hillary Clinton and has more recently voted for Joe Biden. But I do appreciate some of these liberals who are saying the kinds of things we've been saying. And in this particular article, it's entitled, "The Political Effort to Limit Free Speech Attacks Our Own Values." Now, again, he would certainly, by and large, feel more comfortable with people at the Washington Post, at the New York Times, at CNN, although I have heard now he's going to be at least a commentator for Fox News, but only because they wanted to provide something. And he's been an analyst for CBS. He's been an analyst for BBC. So, again, they'll try to tar him with a brush because all of a sudden now he's willing to not only go on the BBC and CBS and CNN, but he also is willing to go on Fox. And he says, increasingly, free speech in the United States is described as a danger that needs to be controlled, as opposed to the very value that defines us as a people. While I'm viewed as a free speech purist by many, I maintain that once was a mainstream view of free speech. I believe free speech is the greatest protection against bad speech. I agree. That view is admittedly under fire and may even be a minority view today, which is a sad commentary. But history has shown that public or private censorship does not produce better speech. It only produces more censorship and more controlled speech. Then he, as a law professor, says something I'm going to use in one of my commentaries. The Constitution was written not only for these times, it was written during these times. Because he points out that politics, he says, has always been something of a blood sport. At the start of the Republic, Republicans and Federalists were not trying to cancel one another in the contemporary sense. Sometimes they were trying to kill each other in the actual sense, though measures like maybe through the Alien and Sedition Acts and things like that. There was also rampant false conspiracy theories about alliances with Great Britain, France, Spain, other foreign nations. Newspapers and pamphleteers were highly partisan and biased. The point he's making is when people say, well, we got too many conspiracy theories now, we got too much misinformation. Have you looked at the 18th century when the First Amendment was created in the first place? It probably was worse then than it is now. But nevertheless, he goes on to say that now members of Congress are now pushing for public and private censorship on the internet and in other forums. They're being joined by an unprecedented alliance of academics, writers, and activists calling for everything from censorship to incarceration to blacklist. And he's got links, HTML links, so you can see he's not just making this stuff up. You can actually see what is actually being said. He says, for example, an article published in The Atlantic by Harvard law professor Jack Goldsmith and University of Arizona law professor Andrew Kane Woods called for Chinese-style censorship. Again, we have a link to that on the internet, stating that in the great debate of the past 2 decades about freedom versus control of the network, China was largely right and the United States was largely wrong. This is really bad stuff. And so, again, one of the reasons I sometimes try to quote from somebody who wouldn't necessarily agree with the things we talk about here around the table at Point of View, he's saying, guys, this is getting dangerous. We've got to do something different. He then goes on to talk about the most extreme effort was made plain this week as some in Congress sought to pressure companies like AT&T to reconsider whether viewers should be allowed to watch Fox News and other networks. In a recent letter to cable carriers like AT&T, talks about the Democrats that I mentioned yesterday, appeared to mirror calls from activists to drop such networks from their lineups. The members stressed that not all TV news sources are the same and called those companies to account for their role in allowing such dissemination. As I've said before, if you really are concerned about misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, then the thing you would not want to do is cancel well-written books and articles. I know, like Dr. Ryan Anderson we talked about yesterday, a book that even his critics admit is well written in terms of looking at the medical, scientific, and legal issues associated, for example, with transgenderism. But guess what? He got canceled. After the break, by the way, we're going to talk about the cancel culture with Dr. Seuss, if nothing else. But just before we take a break, let me go to his conclusion. Jonathan Turley, again, is the professor of public interest of law at George Washington University. And he says, I do not believe today's activists will succeed in removing the most watched cable news channel in 2020 from the airwaves. That'd be Fox News. But then again, I did not think social media sites, given legal immunity in exchange for being content neutral, would ever censor viewpoints. The measures being discussed in Congress have the potential to defeat us all. It is surprisingly easy to convince a free people to give up their freedoms and exceedingly difficult to regain those freedoms once they are lost. Very good article by Jonathan Turley. Again, I try many times to quote from people who we wouldn't necessarily agree with, but who are actually raising some of the same concerns because they recognize that once you start constraining free speech for one group, pretty soon it covers all those groups. It's the article and really the argument, if you will, that Kelly Shackelford has made sometimes when he speaks to groups where most of his audience are not Christians. Because really, how do you talk about religious liberty when you talk to a secular audience? Well, his argument is very plain, and that is if they take a religious liberty away from us, sooner or later, they're going to take liberty away from you. And it's amazing to me how many times he's had atheists come up to him and say, you know, you're absolutely right. or even more pointedly, individuals that lived under the Soviet Union, under the Iron Curtain's really strong hand, said, yes, when they came in to take away our liberty, they started first with the churches, but sooner or later, everybody lost their liberty. So if nothing else, Jonathan Turley understands that danger, and that is one of the articles we've posted today on the website, and I would encourage you to read it. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about the cancel culture and one more example, a tragic one, I would say, and that is a tragic example of what has happened now to the Dr. Seuss books. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to talk about Dr. Seuss for just a few minutes, and sometimes I say, too bad we don't keep the microphones on during the break, because the conversation I had with my producer probably will be as interesting as some of the things I'm going to say over the next few minutes. But let's see if we can get into this, because yesterday was Read Across America Day. It was launched back in the 1990s, and it, interestingly enough, coincides with the birthday of the man known as Dr. Seuss. You know his whole name, but anyway. And in the past, President George W. Bush, President Barack Obama, and President Donald Trump issued proclamations celebrating Read Across America, and they also applauded Dr. Seuss for his books that brought joy. Well, what happened? Well, the woke mob, or the social justice warriors that have been trying to erase Christopher Columbus, George Washington, Robert E. Lee, and others, have decided that it's time for Dr. Seuss to go. So I have this very long piece for those of you that are English majors, maybe librarians, maybe you're just want to have something a little bit more. This is probably the best piece I've found by Don McLaughlin against canceling Dr. Seuss. He starts out by saying the cancel culture has many faces. Few reveal the ugliness of the impulse more clearly than banning books. This time the target of the book banners, of course, is Dr. Seuss. And, of course, it gets into that whole issue of what has come from not only Joe Biden, but also from the Southern Poverty Law Center. I won't get into all those details. Now, we were off air talking about the fact that it's only 6 books. Well, you got to understand the context. 6 books so far have been decided to they will no longer publish. That was a decision made by the Dr. Seuss Enterprises, but more to come. And many of those are ones that maybe you haven't read that often, like And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, If I Ran the Zoo, McElliot's Pool, On Beyond Zebra, Scrambled Egg Super, The Cat's Quizzer, things like that. But again, even here, Dan McLaughlin points out the statement that is made by the Dr. Seuss Enterprises gives no detail on what was offensive and who the panel of experts were that decided to drop those. And, of course, the bottom line is there are more to come. If you go to some of these articles, one of the biggest criticisms I've surfaced, and this was in the New York Post, was, well, there are just too many white faces in Dr. Seuss. Well, some of them are green faces, and some of them are not even human. So, okay, you're really, again, counting by skin culture and all of that. And then I think in this article, by the time you get to the 3rd page, he talks about the real goal in some cases was to teach that you don't discriminate, but instead it's been perceived as, well, if anything, white supremacy or just supremacy generally. And he uses one of the examples from one of the stories called the Sneetches. And if you remember the Sneetches, these were these identical birds, but then some of the birds had stars on their bellies and some do not. And so the star belly Sneetches look down on the starless Sneetches until you've got a monkey gets involved. I won't go through the whole story, but the ultimate lesson, I think, is that you shouldn't look down on somebody because they do or do not have stars, or they do or do not have your characteristics, skin color, hair color, ability, whatever it is. But some have looked at it and said, no, this is all about supremacy. It's like, no, it was really trying to actually teach non-discrimination. And it's interesting that back in 1998, Dan McLaughlin points out that NATO and the United Nations even distributed copies of this book, which was translated into Serbo-Croatian in Bosnia, so that maybe they could tamp down some of the ethnic hatred that was there. But you can kind of see where it's going. Anything that even now in the 21st century doesn't exactly fit your perception. And I'll be the first to admit some of his cartoons from 80 years ago, okay, some of them I wouldn't draw today, but they still teach a point. And if nothing else, if you're not familiar with Dr. Seuss, he was born in 1904, really shaped by a lot of the events of the Second World War. He was obviously a man of the left. This is where I think it's so interesting for people to recognize this is a cancel culture, but it comes after its own many times as well. He was teaching all sorts of messages. Let's just talk about a few. Yertle the Turtle, written in the 1950s, was really, in a sense, written against dictators, and treats the downfall of a despotic turtle king with his comeuppance. The Butter Battle Book, if nothing else, preaches against the arms race. Of course, in the 1940s, he had Horton Hatches the Egg, which is a profound reflection on fatherhood and all of the rest. And We certainly could not end this hour by not forgetting 1957's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which was sort of a classic twist on Dickens' A Christmas Carol, in which you have the Grinch's redemption, and some of the others, or even the idea of the Lorax, which is kind of a heavy-handed anti-capitalist environmentalist story. But it is kind of interesting that when you get into all of this, it is, again, an illustration of the fact that, if anything, Dr. Seuss politically was probably on the left, but this cancel culture has come for him. And it's come for him because maybe it doesn't express the woke sentimental values today and the sentiments of some of the ideas that people have. And as a result, we have a cancel culture that is developing. And what I thought was so striking is Gary Bauer the other day posted something I'd not seen before. But when you ask people in the latest survey about the cancel culture, 64% of Americans, almost two-thirds, believe that the cancel culture is a threat to freedom and liberty. So my bottom line is that when this cancel culture is taking place, most Americans are against it. But the reason we have a cancel culture is there's too few people willing to stand up and say, enough, stop, don't do this anymore. This is crazy. But nevertheless, that's the way it's unfolding. And if we don't put a stop to it, not only will they be canceling Christian ideas and Christian books, but also, in the case of Dr. Seuss books that many times have kind of a liberal perspective, but it's enough to have those people in the woke mob to set their hair on fire and go after somebody like Dr. Seuss. Let's take a break, though, and when we come back, I'm going to spend some time talking about this new book, Why You Matter, how your quest for meaning is meaningless without God. It's a very effective book that I think would be helpful in reaching out to the younger generation, and it comes from Michael Sherrard, who is not only a pastor at the Crosspoint Community Church, but also a faculty member of Summit Ministries. Been very gifted at talking to young people. I think you're going to really enjoy that conversation. But just before we take a break, one last time, let me encourage you to go to the website, which is pointofview.net. In the middle section, you will see a thing that says Take Action. And for those of you that haven't taken the time to contact your 2 United States senators, we've made it very easy. Click on the button that says Take Action, then contact your senators. You put in your zip code, and immediately what you will find is a way in which it will pop up your 2 United States senators, a suggested letter which you can edit, and then you can click Submit and send it off. And having done your civic duty expressing your opinion about this Equality Act that we've been talking about this week. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to talk about some very important topics that maybe will help you more effectively reach the next generation with the gospel and with the truth of the Bible. So let's take a break. We will continue that conversation right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about how to reach out to those who maybe when you share the gospel with them or you talk about your Christian convictions, they say, well, no, I'm good, you know, and it's like, I don't think you can really live without God and without belief in something. And they go, no, I'm good. And I think you're going to find out very quickly that as this book talks about, the quest for meaning is meaningless without God. And we're going to spend some time talking about how to reach out to those, but also for how we as Christians should live with joy in so many different events. And this book just came out yesterday, a March 2nd release from our friends at Baker Books, and it is entitled Why You Matter, How Your Quest for Meaning is Meaningless, and it's written by Michael Sherrard. Might just mention the foreword is by Jeff Myers, who's a good friend of this ministry. He's been here before, and you might pray for him. He's going through cancer treatment right now. Last time I saw him, he had no hair. And so he is an individual that writes the foreword because our guest, who is the author of this book, Michael, is the lead pastor at Crosspoint Community Church and an individual that also is a faculty member at Summit Ministries. And, of course, also teaches for the Life Training Institute. You probably have, if you've run into him, had a chance to hear him at a church or a camp or something of that nature. He's the author of the book Relational Apologetics and an individual that really is helping us understand how to begin to challenge others to consider the fact of what meaning is and how it's rooted in God, and then how those of us that maybe have meaning need to exhibit joy. So, Michael, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thanks for having me on.
Well, if nothing else, we were just mentioning that this foreword, which is certainly a very powerful one by Jeff Myers, he's certainly in need of prayer right now, wouldn't you say?
Yes, Jeff is a good man. He has ministered sacrificially to a number of people. It's hard to estimate his impact for the kingdom. So he is one, that definitely needs prayer. And in a sense, it's right for those that have been ministered by him to have that sense of obligation to meaningfully pray for Jeff on a regular basis. I know he would appreciate it. Jeff's been very open throughout all of this, where many ministry leaders, they lead kind of private lives. They feel they kind of have to be isolated, not let anybody see their weakness. That's not Jeff. He's a vulnerable, honest man. He's a good example of what it looks like to follow Jesus Christ. And so any of those that are inclined to pray for him during a time like this, it'd be welcomed.
I might just mention, he says, you're the kind of guy he wants to be in a foxhole with, so obviously he thinks very highly of you, and we're going to give our listeners a chance to hear more about you as we spend this hour together. Might just mention the endorsements come from all sorts of people that have been on this program: J. Warner Wallace and Sean McDowell and John Stonestreet, Natasha Crane, Brent Kunkel, Scott Klusendorf, Ben Mitchell, and Corey Miller, all of whom have been on the program at one time or another. So you come in great company. But as we get into this book, this was one that you certainly felt the need to write in some respects, you also said it was hard to write, but I guess that's always the experience that we have. But it's getting into this idea of what makes life meaningful. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, I do run into our atheist friends who say, oh, I'm good, I'm good without God. And I think what you try to do early on is challenge that premise that you can find any kind of meaning without having meaning that's rooted in God.
Yeah, the fundamental question is if meaning can be created out of nothing. And this is a fundamental contrast between Christianity and worldviews that deny the existence of God. Christianity starts with the idea that life is imbued with inherent meaning because it was created by God for a purpose, but also on purpose. That means there's a moral order to life, but there's also just purpose to life because it is the act of creation. Within that creation, human life is intrinsically valuable because we are made in God's image. So when it comes to, as it pertains to a meaningful life, those are really two big ideas: inherent meaning and intrinsic value.
Right.
If God doesn't exist, those two things go away. Life is inherently meaningless because life is here by accident, a random process of genetic mutations that resulted in life as we now know it. So life wasn't made for any purpose, so there is no inherent purpose or meaning to the universe. And human life is not intrinsically valuable because it's simply the result of this long process. We got here the same way the cockroach got here. So it's not that human life is intrinsically valuable. We might become functionally valuable. These are two really big contrasting positions. One where if God exists, you start the quest for meaning in a world that is inherently meaningful and your life is intrinsically valuable. In the atheistic world, you start from a position of inherent meaninglessness and no intrinsic value and functional value. So the question then that does remain for the atheist is, can you create meaning for yourself in such a way that it is truly meaningful? And is it possible for humans to acquire value? Those are really hard questions for the atheist to answer.
I think so. And early on, you quote from Steven Pinker, who is a psychologist, and his book Enlightenment Now I've actually done commentaries on, because whether you believe in secular humanistic ideas or whether you believe in evolutionary thought or whatever it might be, this whole concept that we've been talking about, Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, well, if you start from an evolutionary point of view, no lives matter. And so early on, you really help us understand in this introduction that it's time to figure out why you matter, because people throw out all sorts of phrases about meaning and why people matter, but they've never really thought about the philosophical underpinnings. And that's really what your book is attempting to do, isn't it?
Yeah, and part of that is just to help bring a little bit of clarity. We live in a pluralistic society. It has Christian origins and a Christian heritage, and a lot of people are influenced by the Christian worldview. Of course, Christians are influenced by the Christian worldview, but so are a number of atheists and those who ascribe to different worldviews. Well, the more our society becomes secular and pluralistic, it's also happening for Christianity, that Christians are increasingly becoming influenced by other worldviews. And so today, I don't know that it's even right to think in terms of people possessing a singular worldview. It's like we've got this smorgasbord kind of worldview. It's an amalgamation of a bunch of different ideas that shouldn't coexist together because they're contradictory in nature, but they've found a place in our home, and we kind of have this pseudo-Christian or pseudo-atheist worldview where we're kind of borrowing ideas from each other. And so one of the things that I really try to do in the beginning of the book is to help clarify this issue and to allow both the believer and non-believer alike to sort out what their actual beliefs are as it pertains to a meaningful life, but then also ask the really important question: where did that belief come from? Is that a belief that has its origin in a Christian heritage, or is that a belief that has an origin in a naturalistic or a secular one? Yes. And it's not really an argument. I don't start off that's not an argument to persuade somebody that God exists. It's just, I think, a helpful process for us all to really think meaningfully about where did our beliefs come from in this pursuit of a meaningful life.
We're going to take a break, continue our conversation right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Caldwell Swice admits that reaching your secular friends with the gospel is difficult, but there are things we can do to be more effective. He and I have worked together at the International Society of Christian Apologetics, so I was excited to see many commentators like Ed Stetzer and Eric Metaxas quoting him. Caldwell says we make a mistake when we ignore the trends and zeitgeist of the times, and we make grave mistakes when we try to stereotype people into this or that category. Sometimes the best starting point is to ask a question. When someone tells him that they don't believe in God, he asks, "What God do you not believe in?" He says that 9 times out of 10, it is usually a God that we Christians don't believe in. He has 3 principles we should adopt so that we can be more effective in reaching our secular friends. First, we must engage. He says we should sit at the table where we have the attention of your secular friends. Connect with them by getting involved with Apple computers, with Congress, or with sports. We'll be more effective if we sit at the table where most decisions are made by government, culture, media, and education. Second, we must inquire. That means we need to turn the table to listening and asking good questions. The Bible admonishes us to let your speech always be gracious and seasoned with salt. He tells of a student who told him that he did not believe in anything that is not physical. Caldwell asked him if his idea was physical. After all, not believing in anything that is non-physical is a non-physical idea. Third, we should edify. That means we should reach across the table and learn to love people redemptively. The gospel is ultimately about relationships, and we can demonstrate the truth of the gospel through love. These principles will help you be more effective in reaching your secular friends. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Michael Sherrard, a lead pastor at Crosspoint Community Church, author of the book Why You Matter, How Your Quest for Meaning is Meaningless Without God. And you were mentioning something that you do talk about, that Christians and atheists oftentimes borrow from one another. And I suspect you probably know Frank Turek. I remember years ago he wrote that book, which we talked about on this program, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. Because in some cases, the atheist has to believe in God or believe in a moral standard to even make moral judgments. But there are some times in which Christians living in a secular world have become conformed to the culture rather than transformed by the renewing of their minds in Christ Jesus. So I guess it gets into one of the questions you ask early on in the book. What makes our lives meaningful? If, as a Christian point of view, we need to make sure that we have the right particular understanding of what meaning is. And frankly, sometimes we try to get our meaning from our work, from our pursuits, from our successes. And in some respects, it really brings us back to the foundational principle. What does make our life meaningful?
I think it's important to know that when we talk about this topic, when we refer to does our life have meaning, I do think we're talking both about a sense of fulfillment, but we're also talking about purpose. I think a meaningful life is about fulfillment that comes from knowing your actions correspond to something of actual value. When we question whether our lives have meaning, I think we all have some standard that we're judging our lives by. What is that standard? Is it ourselves? Is it the expectations we've set for our own life? Is it society, or perhaps something smaller, our family? Are we looking at what they have set up as expectations for this counts as a life of meaning and value? And these are all subjective, right? These are just subjective standards of others.
Yes.
Or are we looking at some objective standard, something like God? And that's really the fundamental question. Because you're right, these other things, they're all good. They do bring satisfaction. But the problem when it comes to life's meaning is typically we'll reduce it simply to a feeling of satisfaction. But that's not it. The feelings come and they go. Moreover, we've been satisfied by things that later in life we reflected on and realized they were bad. So fundamentally, what is it that makes our lives valuable? What standard are we to look to that is worthy enough to judge our actions and our lives as to be meaningful? And I think that's what we're looking at after. We're not looking after, we're looking for, we're not simply looking for happiness. We're looking for some kind of purpose that gives us some kind of peace that enables us to endure even the hard times in life. And of course, what Christianity puts forward is this: human beings are made in God's image. That is the greatest thing about who we are, and it is the source of our value. And our value is unimaginable. Now, the Bible is not perfectly clear on what it means to be made in the image of God. It's referenced a handful of times. The Hebrew words are selim and demuth, and respectively they're translated as likeness and image. Some scholars think there's a very distinct meaning between the two. Others think that they are used interchangeably. I'm in the camp that think they are more used interchangeably than have a distinct meaning, but there's reasonable debate about that. Either way, what is clear about this phrase is that it's used to show human beings' special relationship to God and the unique way we reflect his glory. In Scripture, it's also the basis for why you're not allowed to shed innocent blood. The big picture is in the created world, there is nothing like us that relates to God in the way that we do and reflects his glory. And since all people equally share that same nature, that means that we are all equally valuable. And there's nothing we could ever do, nothing we could ever become, nothing good or bad we could ever do. The simple fact is our value is fixed because of what we are. And this great truth is a liberating truth that allows us to make sense of a lot of the rest of life. And it is the starting place. It is the firm foundation for beginning to think about a life of meaning.
I might just mention that 6 of your 10 chapters deal with the issue of joy, so we will certainly get to that in a minute. But for the person out there listening who says, well, I think maybe a non-Christian or an atheist or one of the so-called nuns, atheist, agnostic, or no preference, they can maybe find some meaning. And so you do devote a chapter to that issue that our new atheists are saying, I can still find meaning there, but again, you have all sorts of problems with that. The problem of trying to find any kind of morality because you don't have a moral standard, trying to have any kind of meaning when you believe that the universe happened as a cosmic accident. So just before we take a break, let's talk about how there have been attempts by our atheist friends to try to find meaning, but it really falls short, doesn't it?
Right. The atheist position is that the fact that there is no inherent meaning to life is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's kind of childish to view life in the sense of we need a God to make our life meaningful. Dawkins calls that childish. He says, no, we're free to create meaning for ourselves. Sure, there's no ultimate meaning to the universe, but that does not mean that we can't create our own meaning. And in a sense, that does sound freeing and kind of adult-like, right? Why follow the decree on high from this God when we ourselves can establish that for ourselves? There's a lot of freedom there. Well, there's also a futility to it that I think was really expressed and captured well in a conversation I had with a young girl after one of my lectures. She was a college student. She was a very bright girl, respectful. She was an atheist. And she comes up to me after this talk and says, listen, I hear what you're saying, and I'm tracking, and kind of here's my problem. And she starts first with the freedom side of it. She says, if God does not exist and there's no ultimate purpose to life, this is a freeing idea. She says life can be so stressful From the moment you can talk, people are asking you, what do you want to be when you grow life? And it never stops, she says. Get good grades so you can get into good school, so you can get a good job. Take a side on this issue. Join this club. Try this sport. The pressure to do and do and do and do never stops. So the idea that there's no ultimate meaning to life, she says, is freeing. It removes the burden of stress of living up to a standard, because if there is no standard, you cannot fail. Bake cookies, make millions, solve a social justice issue, or play video games in your mom's basement the rest of your life. It all is the same in a universe lacking kind of an ultimate standard. Whatever makes you happy, that's your life's purpose. She goes, but
I was waiting for the but. Yeah.
On the other hand, she goes, it would be kind of nice to know that my actions mattered in a way that had more ultimate significance than simply satisfying my subjective preferences.
Right. You just can't live in that world. I mean, it is something that C.S. Lewis has talked about. It's people like Greg Kokel on this program and others. You have a worldview that does not correspond with your emotional desires and your feeling about what is or is not appropriate, because in that world, you can do anything. You could even do all sorts of horrendous evil, and it would never be considered evil because it just is. And so when you start hearing some of these statements by Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and, of course, Dawkins and all sorts of other people, Sam Harris, these are all really dark statements about the meaningless of life, and unfortunately they can't really live consistently with that. But let us take a break, and when we come back, one of the things that I think is so helpful in your book is you take us through this idea of joy. Creative joy and the chance for joy is one of the ideas that we're going to talk about. And then we'll spend some time talking about joy in our identity, joy in our calling, joy in loving our enemies, joy in our hardship, even learning how to fight for joy. We'll talk about what that means, and joy in what's really real. And it is a new book that has just come out. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it as well on our website in both paperback and Kindle, published by Baker. Why You Matter, How Your Quest for Meaning is Meaningless Without God. And again, we also have information about Michael, which will take you to his particular website. It's Michael C. Sherrard, but you don't have to remember how to write that out because we have that on our website as well. And so if you'd like to get this book, it is available both in paperback and Kindle. It is just out, and it is going to be a resource that you may want to use, but also I think could be a very great resource to reach out to some of those unsaved friends, especially some of these young people that are saying, oh, I'm good. I can find meaning in life. I don't need this idea of God. It's really freeing, yes, but it would be nice to believe that what you do echoes through eternity, and I think that it does. That's a phrase out of a very famous movie, but if nothing else, it's also a biblical principle, which we'll talk about more right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continuing our conversation today with Michael Sherrard. If you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Book just came out, Why You Matter, How Your Quest for Meaning is Meaningless Without God. We're going to focus on the subject of joy, but Michael, just before we do so, let's talk about what is on your website. Michael C. Sherrard, 2 R's, as well as the information, michaelcsherrard.com, helping the church reach a new generation, theology, worldview, apologetics, ethics, art, the church, mission. There are all sorts of great resources there. It's also a place where people can order the book, even watch a little bit of a trailer for the book as well. But there are all sorts of resources that you have made available to our listeners. And so not only do our listeners in Georgia that maybe attend your church get a chance to benefit from that, but people all over the country can go to your website and they will find, what will they find when they land there?
Yeah, information about me, some articles, videos, lectures, both small and long, interviews and whatnot. Just some resources to help you think through life's important issues from a biblical framework. You know, my ministry beyond the local church has been in the apologetics and worldview arena. So I do have a pastor's heart. You know, I don't engage ideas for ideas' sake. I engage ideas to love and protect God's people, because we know truth sets people free, but lies have the opposite effect, and we are living in a world where lies are imprisoning people, promising life, but ultimately stealing it. And so as a pastor who engages in apologetic and worldview, that's my drive. It's to combat these ideas such that people are set free by the truth of Jesus Christ.
This half hour, we're going to be talking about this idea of joy, but it also ties into love, a chapter, Creative Love, and our chance for joy, because you talk about the meaning of love, the meaning of relationships, and the meaning of work. So how does that all tie together?
It all goes back to purpose. Again, if God exists, there is purpose, objective purpose to life. We are made in his image. We have been given the calling by God to care for his creation. Other human beings are equally valuable as us. So, and then there's a moral order to life, this moral order that is, it comes forth from God's nature. God is morally pure. He is essentially loving. He is essentially just. And so his ethical decrees are extensions, they're outworkings of his character. So within the universe, assuming God exists, there is objective purpose, even in terms of morality. And how this affects relationships is huge. If God does not exist, what are the purpose of relationships? They're utilitarian in nature. We are to coexist and get along solely for the survival of our species. You think about what even love is in a universe lacking purpose and a moral order. What is love? I mean, it's kind of hard to answer that question, but if you've been in just romantic love, you can describe it, you know, in words like passion or this transcendent bliss, this state of wanting to be one with another, that you would do anything for this other person. And it's beautiful, right? Books are written about this. Movies are made. But what is that if God does not exist? It's reduced to an instinct that exists because of natural selection. If God does not exist, we are nothing more than biochemical machines. We exist in the way that we do because it was advantageous for our survival. The habits, the practices that we have, the intuitions and the instincts are all here simply because they worked, because they allowed us to survive. So love in this universe, a godless universe, is cold, lifeless, pragmatic. It lacks a benevolent quality. And of course, it may be true that that's the world that we live in. I'm not making a strong argument here from love based on God's existence, though I do think that is a good apologetic, right? Because is that what love is? Or is there something in love and relationships where we are concerned with the good of the other person, not just because it's advantageous for us? Now, that all makes sense if God exists, and that's the world that he has created, that other people are valuable because they're made in his image, love exists because God is a relational being, triune in nature. We can serve other people as an act of worship to glorify God and love people for what they are rather than what they can do for us. So again, it's just a really contrasting kind of world. And even those that don't believe in God's existence, I think they operate and act as if he does exist, because we don't live in a world where people, I think, really believe that relationships are simply transactional in nature, and love is simply an evolutionary construct that we have because it helps us survive.
Yeah, you just cannot live in a world where my thoughts are just brain states and love is just an instinct from evolutionary process. So obviously that is one of those powerful aspects of that. You know, you have chapters on the joy in our identity and the joy in our calling. I thought we might put those two together because in some respects, that's really, again, back to meaning, purpose, because we should have a joy in who we are and even what God has called for us to do.
Yeah. So identity is a big issue today, right? And for all of us, we know of somebody that has struggled with who they are. They've gone through an identity crisis. When you don't know who you are, it's this very lonely place where you can't really make sense of the past. You have a hard time knowing what to do about your future, and you don't feel like you're worth anything. That's a huge problem. Now, the way that I think it's proper for us to think about our identity is that it's not wrong to think, when we talk about identity, we're talking about what makes me and not you. We are different people. We have different experiences. We have different characteristics. We've had different achievements. We look different. And there's nothing wrong in thinking about identity in that way. You know, like when I conceive of who is Mike Sherrard, if I answer that question, well, it's not wrong for me to answer, well, I'm a Christian man, I'm married, I have 5 kids, I have a cap on my right front tooth, I wear a size 12 shoe, I play baseball, and list a whole number of things. These are all of the things that make me the unique individual that I am. The problem with identity, though, is we typically grab onto 1 or 2 things that we really like about ourselves, whether it's a characteristic or an achievement, and that becomes the essence of who we are and why we think we matter. That's the problem. Because the essence of who we are, it's not our characteristics, it's not our achievements, it is the fact that we are made in God's image. That is the single greatest thing about us, and it puts all these other things into perspective, and it allows us to be comfortable in our unique identities. And this also translates into it helps liberate us from the burden of work. Similar, work often becomes this thing that is very stressful because we view it as the thing that gives our life worth and meaning. But if we are made in God's image and we are intrinsically valuable by virtue of what we are, we do not work to earn value. We work because we are valuable, and so are other people. Work is transformed into an act of love and stewardship. I'm to be a faithful steward of the life God has given me, the abilities, the experience, and the desires I have. And I'm to use them for God's glory and the good of other people. So why go be a doctor? Not for the significance that society will give you and the approval that your parents will give you, or the money that will allow you to build your own personal kingdom. No, go be a doctor, because that's how your brain works. And you have the desire to see sick people made well. Why go be a lawyer? Not, again, for the prestige that this will give you in a given society. No, go be a lawyer because you want to see that all people who bear God's image receive fair treatment under the law. Why go be a teacher? All of these reasons stay the same. Moreover, why can you have the freedom to stay home and raise your children when the rest of the world is going to look down upon you for doing that? You can do that because you are stewarding the gifts that you have given to love your children and to raise them in the way that they should go, which is an incredibly noble thing to do. And even though the world is going to say, oh, well, you can't cut it in the workforce, and the world might diminish your value because of that, that's fine. You let them feel valuable by their $45,000 salary and the fact that they're the assistant to the regional manager. You go do what God has called you to do. And if during this time it is raise your kids, do that with all the dignity and the nobility as anybody else in this country.
So again, some of the chapters on the joy in our identity, the joy in our calling. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the difficult parts. What about joy in loving our enemies? That's a tough one. Or joy in our hardship. And most importantly, this idea of fighting for joy. It's all part of the book, Why You Matter, How the Quest for Meaning is Meaningless Without God. It is published by Baker Books. It has just come out. And it really kind of gets into whether life is meaningful. And as we've talked about here, the attempt by many of our atheist friends to try to find meaning when they start with the assumption that there is no meaning, there is no God, there is no purpose, there's no teleology, there's no end point, there's no ultimate judgment, there is no heaven, there's no hell. They still sort of act as if they believe it, but they say they don't. And so we'll come back and talk about, okay, how about joy in some of these difficult circumstances? And we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Michael Sherrard for a few more minutes. Why You Matter is the new book out by Baker. He is the author and, of course, has been with us this last hour. And I thought we might focus on two of the chapters that talk about difficulties, because it's one thing to be joyful in your calling, in your identity, and when things go well. But you do have some chapters on joy in loving our enemies and joy in our hardship. But in some respects, once we understand our place in the world, once we understand meaning, then some of those difficult paths that we all have to actually traverse are necessarily easier. I'm not saying they're perfect or they're easy, but they're easier, and there is a sense of meaning. You can find meaning in suffering and hardship. Even when individuals are mean to you, you can learn how to love your enemies because you have joy. Isn't that fair?
Yeah, excuse me. The joy that comes from knowing God and what you are made for, I think, is an abiding joy. But there are things that can suppress that. Hatred is one of them. Hatred consumes us. And I think right now, hatred is a sickness that is spreading across this country. The pandemic has further isolated us from one another. We're living in these echo chambers. We're cut off from each other, and we're growing in hatred for those that don't think like us. And it's a sickness. And it's just not the Christian way. You think about the world that birthed Christianity, the first century Rome. It was a violent place. Rome put their enemies on a cross as a spectacle for all of the world to see. It was their way to display their might and to warn those who would come against us. In other words, if you cross Rome, this is where you go. You go to the cross. The cross was excruciating. It was public. It lasted for days. Jesus turned this world upside down. Rather than conquering his enemies and putting them on a cross for the world to see, Jesus willingly went to the cross himself and died for his enemies. No greater love has the world seen than that. And the ethics that flowed from the cross changed the world. The followers of Jesus Christ were taught to love like they had seen Jesus love. And this changed the world. If there's anything that our country needs right now, it's for the followers of Jesus Christ to rise up, lead by example, follow the example set for us by the founder of our faith, Jesus Christ, and love our enemies. It brings great joy. So similar to that is hardship. Hardship is another thing that suppresses joy, and I get it. I've known hardship. I talk about it a bit in the book. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we struggle with when we face hardship is we question our significance, because it's natural in the sense, if God is good and God loves me, why is he allowing me to endure this? Have I done something to offend God? Has he forgotten me? Am I not that significant? That kind of assumes that the purpose of life is a lack of hardship, or the purpose of life is happiness. And it's not. It's greater. It's deeper. It's more significant. It's knowing God and living out the calling he has given us as image bearers. So there is a purpose to hardship, and knowing the purpose to hardship allows you to endure it and even find joy in the midst of it, as Scripture speaks to several times.
Just before we run out of time, you talk about fighting for joy, and maybe we'll make that kind of our last point, because in some respects that is key, because you have to learn to fight for joy sometimes when it's gone.
Yeah, in the Christian world, there can be this pressure to just be happy. That if you're not happy, if you're sad, if you're depressed, if you're lonely, it's just because you don't have enough faith. Read your Bible more. That is a terrible idea that is inflicting a tremendous amount of pain on sincere followers of Jesus Christ. Joy, like I said before, I think is an abiding reality. The joy that comes from knowing the Lord, it doesn't go away, but other things can cover it up and can suppress it. Unconfessed and unrepentant sin can do that. Hatred can do that. Hardship can do that. So the fight for joy, it is a fight. You have to be diligent to work and live in the joyful reality that we have been given. And there's kind of three, things that I do. And there's probably more. I'm not saying these are the only three, but three keys that really help me live in the joy of my meaningful life. The first one is to constantly remind myself what makes my life meaningful. One of the things that, again, robs me of joy is when I start using another standard other than the fact that I'm made in God's image and loved by him. When I start using another standard for my value. When I look at my relationships, if ever experienced betrayal, like me and my wife have, that can make you feel like your life is worth nothing. If you're failing at your job, you can feel like your life is worth nothing. If you make a mistake, anything, right? If these are your standards for your life significance, when you lose them, you lose your significance. So just fight to remind yourself of the greatest thing about you, and it is the fact that you were made in God's image and made in a way such that you can know him and you are known by him. The second is to remind yourself of what joy is set before you. Mm-hmm. So often we spend our entire life in the pursuit of future joy, and we miss out on what is right in front of us. A lot of Ecclesiastes talks about this, that there's a vain part to life. We're trying to control outcomes, and we're living in the world of outcomes. And there's nothing wrong with planning for the future, but don't do so at the expense of enjoying the simple things, the gifts that are right in front of you. For example, I talk about the joy of writing a book. When I was writing this, a good friend helped me to just enjoy it. Don't be so stressed out about what you hope this book might do, which it may or may not do for any number of reasons that are entirely outside of your control. Don't miss the chance to enjoy the great gift of writing a book. Laugh at those funny lines that you want to put in that book that the publisher would never let you put in the book. Cry over the parts that break your heart. Probably my favorite part of this book is about a dear friend of mine that committed suicide that's not in the book. Wow. It's weird to say, it's not enjoyment, but there's a part of this book that I can cherish that nobody else ever will. And I could have missed all of this if my eyes were just on the future and living in the what ifs, which kind of leads into the last part.
Yeah, what is really real. Yeah.
Fight to live in what is really real.
That's right.
We spend so much time living in the what ifs. What if I had done that? And another kind of what if is the motivation. This person did that to me because and you fill in the blank for their motivation. Now, maybe they did it for that reason, or maybe they did it for any number of reasons, but you have chosen to live in a certain kind of reality that you don't know is real.
That's right.
And that steals you of joy. And so these three things really have helped me to fight for joy and live in that reality, to remember what makes my life valuable, to not miss out on the joy that is set right in front of me, and to choose to live in what is really real rather than spend my whole life in the what ifs.
Again, that's that last chapter, The Joy in What's Really Real. Michael, it's been a great program, and I appreciate you not only writing the book and the ministry that you've had, not only in your own church, but at Summit Ministries and other places, but thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Kirby, anytime. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Again, let me commend to you the book. We're just about out of time. It is entitled Why You Matter. Just came out. You may not find it in your local bookstore, but we've got links for you to find it, both in paperback and Kindle. And we also have a link for you to connect up with Michael, who is there in Peachtree City, Georgia, at Crosspoint Community Church. So you have all sorts of resources, which we always make available at our website, which is pointofview.net. Tomorrow we got Matt Krause, we've got George Barna, we've got Jim Dennison. Well, we've got a star-studded cast of individuals that are going to be joining us. I'm looking forward to all sorts of conversation tomorrow, and we'll get into some of the issues in the news. So I hope you'll join us then. Visit the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes, and we will see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.